Hello and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. I'm Jon N.
And I'm Ian G.
Hello. First podcast of the new year, just so that we've put a stake in the ground for anybody who wants to know when we record these. It is after the new year, couple of weeks,
Right.
in fact.
Yeah.
So hopefully in the coming podcasts, we're going to see a couple of episodes which will be slightly different. So look out for those, is what I can say. Right, so Ian, we're on the counterfactual bus yet again. Where are we heading for this time?
Right. So we're going to the Russian Revolution, specifically the first revolution, or the first revolution of 1917, shall we say?
Yeah, I think there was the revolution
2005. Yeah, which made Russia formed in. Sorry. I'm doing the millennial thing. 1905, which made Russia a form of constitutional monarchy. As much as the Tsar lost most of his powers, but I still had an awful lot of influence. But anyway, we're talking about 1917 specifically.
And the February Revolution, if people didn't realise, there was actually two revolutions in...
or March, because Russia was using, and I was getting on that
March, yeah.
Well, Russia was using a Gregorian calendar rather than Julian one still. So,
yeah, it was February to them, but it was March.
Yes.
I've forgotten about that. That's why they call it the February.
Well, it's always
No, it was March the 1st when it was sort of kicked out.
Yeah. So not quite. Yeah, presumably after the revolution, they started using the correct calendar. Although the church still uses the old ones. It's Orthodox Christmas is X days behind everybody else's Christmas. But anyway, yeah. So that's what we're going to discuss today.
So the scenario in February, the first revolution within 2017 essentially got the Tsar to abdicate. That was one of the key concessions that happened. And ultimately, things stayed the same, arguably. There wasn't that much difference in terms of what was happening in Russia at the time, which is what led to the October Revolution. So in our counterfactual universe, we're making the assumption that the February Revolution does essentially what the October Revolution did, or one of the things that it did, which would have potentially had an impact on the longevity of the February Revolution and moved it forward into a more democratic country, rather than the October Revolution, which was run by the Bolsheviks, which didn't want democracy. Communism isn't democracy. So Lenin wanted to be in charge. Even though he was the man of the people, spoke for the people, he didn't want anybody else telling him what to do. So it was a dictatorship is the only way of looking at it like that. We get to February, the Tsar's abdicated. Ultimately, it's a constitutional monarchy, meaning more powers have eroded, probably all of them, apart from some ceremonial type things. And at the time, Russia was being governed by two different groups, all within the same palace, but in different wings. And I can't remember the name of the palace now.
It's a Winter Palace in what?
No, it had a name.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it might have been the Winter Palace.
Well, the capital of Russia at the time was Petrograd, which is now St. Petersburg, but yeah.
That's right, yeah.
That famously is the Winter Palace.
So you had the provisional government in the one wing, and which was the Duma, which is the Russian parliament, and the Petrograd Soviet. I must admit, until I read up about this, I didn't realise what Soviet meant. So because there was many Soviets in Russia, so they were
a committee or something, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah. It's that's why I suppose the USSR was the Union of Socialist
Soviet Republics. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so the regional. I forgot what I called it now. What did I call it? It wasn't regional government.
Duma.
The Duma was the provisional government. And ultimately that had been recognised by the European foreign powers at the time of the February Revolution. But it didn't have any of the... It had the legitimacy, but it didn't have any of the power. So it had authority, but didn't have any power. The power was held by the Soviet, the Petrograd Soviet, because the army and the navy essentially were part of the Soviet Petrograd. And it was very difficult for the provincial government to make things happen because particularly to do with like workers and things like that, and the army, because it was controlled by the Soviet. So one of the sort of our way forward in terms of the counterfactual is that the Soviet was essentially it had multiple political groups within them, but the biggest one was something called the SD. I think it was called the Social Democrats or something like that. And that was split into two factions. One was the Mensheviks and the other one was the Bolsheviks. Now, the Bolshevik means majorities. It means like the majority, and the Mensheviks means minority. But at the time, the Mensheviks were actually the more popular faction. So they were the controlling interest within the Soviet. And they were pro-democracy. They were interested in a democratic approach. The Bolsheviks weren't. They wanted to essentially throw all that out. So if we look at moving forward, then that guy you mentioned yesterday, I've forgotten his name.
Kerensky.
Kerensky. So the key thing with Kerensky was that he was actually a senior member of the Soviet, and he was a minister in the Duma.
Yeah.
And there's he used to run between the wings, apparently, the different wings, when there was what was called the revolution's honeymoon, which was a 6-week period when the Soviet and the Duma were working well together, and he was doing a lot of the arbitration between the two. Now, if we fast forward that and essentially turn that into, it turns into something where instead of them having all of these, it breaking up, it actually starts to form, a better union, so that the issues of the day in Russia, which were mainly economic, I think a lot of it caused by the war. People were, there was a lot of rich people in Russia. They were making a lot of money off industry. Workers didn't have fantastic rights. They were starving, all this type of stuff. They were fighting a war they didn't want to fight. I mean, they did originally want to fight it, but, they'd had a few serious losses, and they were losing lots of people. A lot of men were dying. The concept is that this new government moving forward. So in our counterfactual universe, we have a unified Soviet and Duma, potentially moving forward with the next round of democratic voting for the next Duma, which was supposedly going to happen, but never happened because of the Bolsheviks. But at the end of the day, there was enough people in Russia who wanted a democratic approach to their government, but they didn't want the war and they wanted economic relief and all this type of stuff. So first off, this new government essentially stops fighting, or certainly doesn't fight an offensive war and fights only a defensive one, which is maintaining their land that they'd got and preventing the Germans from advancing. And they weren't going to try and advance into the German territory. They were just going to essentially draw what would have been considered a temporary line. And one of the reasons that the Bolsheviks did this, in terms of agreeing to losing land for with the Germans, was that they believed the Germans would lose and then they'd get their land back from the Allies. So they didn't see it as losing it for, it was almost like, well, they're going to take it, but we're going to get it back.
Yeah.
Because the Germans are going to lose. And that's clearly an option for our counterfactual, where the war's essentially on hold. Or not on hold, but, is certainly nowhere near as significant to the economic aspects of Russia, and things can start looking inward to resolve workers' rights, people but starving, all this type of stuff. So if we then look at Russia in the 1920s, so after the First World War is finished, we have Russia that is a large country with a democratically elected government. Doesn't mean to say that they're right wing or that they're monarchists or whatever. We'll have to agree on what we think the parliament would look like. In terms of the breakdown of how the parliament would be made up. I think that the Soviets wouldn't necessarily have given up their power, and just had it. It's hard to know, because the Duma was part of the 1905 revolution. That was what came out of it. Like you said, the Tsar lost a lot of his powers and it was ceded to the Duma, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And we've got to take it from there. So, okay, so where do you think in the 1920, what do you think the scenario in Russia is currently looking like at that time?
Well, I mean, the thing is, we've got to accept, we've got a counterfactual. I mean, the thing that we've got to accept is that this is quite a big ask, because we haven't talked about the other countries and what became the Soviet Union: Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan, There's probably a couple of others I can't think of. Did I say Georgia? Armenia?
You did say Georgia, but
The
it's funny because there was a lot of Georgians and Ukrainians who were in the Russian government,
right,
which
because that was part of the Russian Federation, but they were brutally repressed in the Soviet era. Whether inverted commas, I mean, what we don't know is because because we're not experts, is that we don't know how. It's one thing saying that let's accept that they're not communist, because that's the whole point of our conversation. But there was some, they might have been, and I suspect he would have been, still Russian nationalists. So Putin isn't a communist, but he's a Russian nationalist and a nasty piece of work. And originally started off as an elected representative through one form or another. So these people may not, although they're arguably better than Lenin and Stalin on the face of it, if you're a Georgian or a Ukrainian or somebody else, unless, and again, maybe George is slightly different, but would you be happy with these Russian Democrats, inverted commas? So there's that aspect. So so we need to park that to a certain extent, or go down that path.
So one option then is that the Ukraine, Georgia essentially become autonomous, but still part of some Russian alliance.
That's Russian Federation, which sounds familiar.
Yeah.
But then we all know how that works out eventually in a post-Soviet Union, don't we? So
I know, but that came from a different background, though, doesn't it? I mean, before the First World War, what was the scenario within Ukraine and Georgia? I mean, I don't know, to be honest. I don't know whether you do.
I don't know either. But I mean, it was part of it was part of Russia, Greater Russia. This is why, thinking of the Crimean War, the 1850s, Crimea is patently geographically inside Ukraine, but it doesn't appear to be part of Ukraine really for a very long time. Certainly over 150, 200 years. So I don't know. That is long and short of it. But in terms of the
conversation, all right. So I mean, I think the best way of looking at it then is to what Russia, what these countries looked like before the First World War is what they would look like after.
Yeah. So what I suggest
we
park the purpose of the conversation. We park the Ukraine, Georgia aspects, and maybe come back to that. But look at how Russia itself would have developed, or But again, it's difficult. The Soviets had a war with Poland in the 1920s, which Poland was a peculiar country in those days because it wasn't really democratic, but it was a hodgepodge of peoples, most of whom were Poles, to be fair, but there was lots of Jewish people there who may have seen themselves as slightly different. There was lots of Germans, which started the Second World War essentially, or was the precursor to the British and French joining starting the Second World War. So they had wars in the Far East. The Soviets, mostly with anti-Soviet forces, or they had a war with the the British and Americans deployed troops in the 1920s into Russia to support the White Russians. So we need to sort of kind of park all that and say, right, that wouldn't have happened because the Western Allies in the First World War. But then, we need to look at would they have stopped fighting the Germans? So I think what we need to do is kind of not look at the Far East, not look at Poland, not look at Ukraine, and just focus around Russia. So the question in my mind is, which we need to discuss, is what would their attitude have been to the Germans, do we think? Now, in the original timeline, they kept the war going. Now, how much of that was just sitting in trenches and holding the line, and how much of that was lack of, whether that was the decision they were doing and they were going to park it and come back to that thought, or whether they didn't have the supplies to do anything else. But
no, I think they were fighting. It did become this defensive thing as to, this is the line, we're going to defend this line, but we're not going to do anything else beyond that.
Right, but I don't think the Russian army would have done anything other than want to go home. Essentially, that's not the case. Yeah. So the odd thing is that the politicians in the pre-Soviet era, revolution, Kerensky and co, didn't recognise that, or if they had a plan, they didn't progress it quickly enough to satisfy the army. When I say the army, I'm talking about soldiers rather than the high command, the common soldier. So I think in our counterfactual, because if we don't have a counterfactual that does this, I think very quickly the second revolution happens. So the counterfactual is that they negotiate or start to negotiate a armistice, a treaty with Germany.
Yeah. No, I think that's what needs to happen
because they've got no choice. I mean, why they didn't do this is, or maybe they were doing it. Maybe they were. Who knows? Maybe they were sabotaged by the Bolsheviks. You just don't know, do you? well, I certainly don't know. Or I don't know if anybody knows. But
No, they weren't trying to. So they weren't.
Well, that was crazy. Really.
Yeah, why they carried on after the Tsar had been.
Well, I think it seems to be part of the Western. I use the word not geographically, but the Western way of life. They want it to be
right, yeah,
modern, and so by that stage, I'm not sure exactly, but certainly America was due to join the war and may have joined it. Or said it joined it by October. So they want to be part of that sort of league. League of Nations is the wrong term because that was later, but that Brotherhood of Nations, modern, democratic, and fighting Germany would appear to be that way. But that was fighting against reality because the soldiers weren't interested. Well, they go home. So let's assume that they cottoned on to that and they realised, well, to protect our country, we need to make a peace with Germany. So that wouldn't. Again, I don't think that would, as we know, that the Bolsheviks did that anyway. Now that resulted in a great offensive in the West, but which was ultimately defeated. So that wouldn't necessarily have made much difference to Germany because that's what happened anyway. But the question is, what happens to Russia then? So Russia becomes not part of the winning side, but becomes sort of neutral.
That's right. So they can concentrate. I mean, there was like you say, there's this view about modernisation within Russia, which had only started a few decades earlier. It wasn't a huge industrial nation, and they was, rapidly expanding to become, a large industrial country. I mean, and obviously there's a huge rural community within Russia. It's because of the size of the country. It's obviously huge. So I've lost my train of thought now. Why did I?
Well, the point being is that they've got this. I mean, I think it's because.
They'd probably gone a bit more insular, wouldn't they? I mean,
yes,
they weren't. So one of the things you have to remember is that the Soviet was made up of people who weren't as keen as the Duma on modernisation, because there was a lot of support from the rural communities who weren't interested in. They just saw it as something newfangled and scary, and we don't want it. So they wouldn't necessarily. They probably wouldn't have just leaped into trying to just become another European power. There would have been introspection, I suspect. Looking at how, what their democracy would look like and what the aim of Russia, where it's going would have been. It still would have been a big industrial country, and I think that would have stopped, but it might not have tried to accelerate as much as I think we're thinking it might.
Yeah, but one thing we need to consider for our timeline, which is not something we always do, is how if we have the assumption that the second revolution didn't happen, we need to explain why not or how not. I think because there's all these, let's say, millions of peasants,
one of the
reasons and soldiers. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that it failed was because I was talking about this.
Yeah, I'm talking about why it wouldn't have failed. Anyway, can't.
No, but why it did fail was because there was a lot of distrust between the Soviets and the Duma, and ultimately we've got to, even though they started putting ministers who were from the Soviets into the Duma, there was still a lot of mistrust, and then they just fell out.
The ultimate problem we've got with this timeline, and this is why, as I said, we need to investigate a wee bit, is that our alternative timeline is that we've got almost literally millions of people, and certainly tens of thousands of highly motivated individuals who aren't interested in discussing anything. They just want to take over. How in our timeline?
Oh, no, but one of the things that you have to. Okay, so I don't know whether you know this. There was an election. It was funny because there were two elections prior to the revolution for the Duma. One that the Bolsheviks didn't.
So which revolution?
The October one, or the February one.
So there was elections before the February.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
There were two, in fact.
Uh-huh.
And one there weren't any Bolshevik candidates, and then there was another one where there was Bolshevik candidates, and they didn't get that many votes. It was quite underwhelming. Then the Mensheviks got the majority of the votes. So what you got to remember is that not everybody is a rabid communist. There's a small, a largish minority, but the majority of the people weren't that interested in all of this.
Yeah, but this largest minority have got access to an army with guns and things. I mean, this is the.
No, I know, but but then this is where you just have a few people who take over and suddenly they're calling the shots, and then people agree, oh, well, they should be calling the shots, so we'll do what they say. This is just people following the leader. I mean, don't forget, the Bolsheviks stormed the Duma and,
Yeah,
to take power. They took it by by force, but they weren't necessarily in the majority. They just did it, and it's like, well, we've got it now. And then people sort of back down and says, all right, you've got
But they were in the majority of people with guns.
Well, in Petrograd, yes.
Yes. Well, but my point, what I was going to go on to say was, I think in our alternate history, the Kerensky government, i.e., the so-called Democrats, they ruthlessly purge the Bolsheviks. No, and that basically means killing a few of them.
Well,
jailing them.
I mean, you say ruthlessly, and which they did. I mean, don't get me wrong, but they were revolutionaries who were committed to overthrowing the government. I mean, it's like if you've got what would you call an organisation like that in any country now that's self-proclaimed revolutionary is going to overthrow your government?
In certain countries, you call it the Republican Party, wouldn't you?
Yeah, no. So all I'm saying is it's not. There's no surprise that
No, but what I mean is when I say ruthlessly, it's basically turning on your one-time semi-colleagues, isn't it? So it's.
Well, yeah, but they didn't kill. They killed a lot, but they didn't kill many of the leaders. I mean, Stalin was in Siberia. He was internally exiled, whereas Lenin was externally exiled.
Yeah, but I'm talking about in our alternative timeline that Kerensky would purge the Bolshevik Party. Otherwise, the timeline, the Soviets.
No, I mean, at the end of the day, if we're talking about him having control of the Soviet, right, so the Soviet then has power over the army and the navy and the working class because it's the Soviet in Petrograd.
Yeah.
Then the Bolsheviks are just a minority that are just shouting, and people are going, "Oh yeah, okay, you're talking." If the people are following the Mensheviks and they're not following the Bolsheviks, then it doesn't matter what the Bolsheviks are shouting.
If you've got a country that's so riven, and you've got people who are willing to kill each other, and you've got.
But when you say riven, what do you mean?
No, well, because you've got people who don't. You've got a significant minority of people who are happy with the old government, which became white Russians, which in the original timeline was a civil war. So you've got X percentage of a majority probably of middle class people. You've got rioting peasants who don't really care about anything as long as somebody comes and tells them what they want to hear and they get fed. You've got an army who wants to give up a war. That's a country that's riven into factions, isn't it?
So in our counterfactual, we're saying that after the February Revolution, that's what happens, that the Mensheviks do actually listen to what everybody's saying and solve those problems. So they stop the war, they start, feeding people, not paying for weapons, all this type of stuff.
Yeah, and what are the Bolsheviks doing while this is all happening? Happily, my point being is,
they're gonna still be plotting.
Yeah. So you have to deal with them, and I think you deal with them by killing them.
Well,
that's the Russian way. I mean,
Okay, so there would be some sort of purge. I mean, at the end of the day, would the Germans have let Lenin back in? Probably not, because I don't know what would have. I mean, so if Lenin wouldn't have been in Russia in 1917, I don't think.
Well, he wasn't.
Because he'd still be in.
Yeah.
Well, he was, because he was there for the October Revolution.
Yeah, because the Germans let him back in.
Right, but if they've already sued for peace, the Russians, are the Germans going to let somebody?
No, but then there's Lenin is the man of the original timeline. Trotsky's still in Russia. There's lots of other people we've never even heard of, but just give me a second to finish this.
Yeah.
What I'm proposing is that that Russia is in a state of crisis. It's got factions all over the place. It's a big country. It's got millions of people in various camps, inverted commas, some of which are quite influential, i.e. the old middle class, some of which are extremists, i.e. the Bolsheviks. The army is ungovernable. The navy, we've wrapped that up into the same boat with lots of weapons and stuff. Is the Kerensky government has to turn itself into a government that's prepared to do what it needs to do to put those people back in their box. Now, what that traditionally means is rounding people up, not sticking them in camps, but not necessarily killing them. Certainly killing some of the leaders or putting them on trial and then hanging them. It has to purge its opponents. If it doesn't purge its opponents are going to purge it, which is essentially what happened.
Or try
in a longer time. Yeah, because if we.
No, so I agree that I think that what we're ultimately saying is that there would be a period of some severe turmoil.
Yeah, but more than that, how do we envisage this government that's set up in March, 4 years or 5 years or whatever it would be, has an election? But that's difficult to see, isn't it? Because what if it has an election and the Bolsheviks win? it's
Well, yeah, but in our timeline, they're not going to. The Mensheviks. Don't forget all I'm saying is that they weren't that popular as a party. If you look at it like that, their policies were only right. One of the things that we have to remember here is that that a lot of this happened in Petrograd. The rest of Russia is very different, and that was something that was a problem after 1917 because not all of the other Soviets were Bolsheviks.
Well, it's a civil war, yeah.
So it's the issue that we're currently focusing on is what's happening in Petrograd, which was the capital. But you've only got to solve the capital, and then arguably there weren't communists outside of Petrograd. Well, that was the hotspot. The rest of but they weren't anywhere near as rabid as because the majority of the industry, the workers, in the army and the navy, they were focused in Petrograd at the time. That was why, and when their industrial awakening was in that particular part of the country. So there was a lot of focus there. Yeah. But what I'm trying to, I'm agreeing with what you're saying. I'm not disagreeing. That there would be a lot of.
I think
it's a conclusion that it's like, let's have some elections. Here we go. But we do have to make the assumption that it does ultimately end up with some sort of stability and some democracy. Well, and that's what we want this counterfactual to be.
Really? But why? I thought we just. Well, I find that difficult to foresee.
Let's stop for a word from our sponsors.
So, Mike, what the actual flippin' heck was going on yesterday during that group video call?
Yeah. During my presentation, let's just say the sound wasn't always coming from my PowerPoint.
Let me guess. You had sprouts the day before? Or maybe beans?
You know me. A high-fiber diet doesn't always leave the wind in the doldrums.
There's no doubt everyone thought you'd had a fart attack.
Yes, I just couldn't stop my trousers from burping.
Haha. Well, you know what you need? Trumpet. The amazing noise-canceling solution for life's disturbances in the force. When you really wish it had been silent but deadly.
Trumpet? What's that?
Trumpet is an AI-powered app that detects and eliminates window rattlers before anyone hears them on your video calls.
Does it really work? My home office is basically a zoo, and when my dog is there, let's just say it has a mind of its own.
Absolutely. Trumpet. Silence is everything. It's like having your own personal sound editor in real time.
So no more awkward stares from my coworkers?
None. And with our Trump Alert feature, it'll even notify you discreetly when it blocks a sound, so you're always in control.
I really need this. Gimme.
Just download it from their store when they're offline.
Trumpet, at last! I can stop making more tea for the vicar.
Oh, no. They've only blummin' gone and done it again.
Today's episode is sponsored by Techno, helping yesterday, today. Techno is a subsidiary of Uncle Schnookums Enterprises, wholly owned and operated by Deforest Co. Global, pioneers in transforming the world's rainforests into your favorite products. All rights reserved. No claims or returns will be honored.
And we're back.
Because Russia's never a democracy.
No, I don't find that. To be fair, I've only read this one book, about the Russian Revolution, and it comes across, and hopefully we'll have some listeners who will shout us down or tell us. Actually, the majority of people wanted more of a democracy. They didn't want a dictatorship. Like most countries where there's a dictator, they're not voting for somebody to come in and order you about.
These two examples were like current day America and Nazi Germany have voted for somebody who would happily be a dictator. I mean, there's no.
Well, at the time, all I'm saying is, at the time, the Bolsheviks took power against the run of the.
Yeah, but my question is, how does the Kerensky government, call it what you like, how does it stop that happening again? Or
like you said, they've got to.
And you think Russia in 1920, or think of the rest of Europe at the time.
Well, it doesn't mean to say that it would be a very stable government, but it would still be not corrupt or whatever. It'd have lots of issues, but it wouldn't be communist. Is what I'm trying to get.
Yeah. Well, my point being is, I don't think we'd be communist either, because I think it would find the whoever was the president or the prime minister. Well, I guess it would be the president. Whoever was the president would be keen to ensure that I'm the only person who will sort of fix this. So I'll make sure that I'm the president next time. you know, and I'll make sure that the people I want to be president next time are the president next time. So you know, Russia.
But there were other. But you're making the assumption that there was a big faction that would have done that, and I don't think that's
It doesn't have
true.
to be a big faction. It just has to be a faction with guns. I mean, that you know, if you look at the context,
But it doesn't happen in every democracy. It didn't happen in France, and I'll get. You know, I mean, all right, that was a bit earlier. You know,
it did happen in France because there were several revolutions in France. You know,
but they didn't end up well.
Napoleon, crikey, you can't get much more of a single figurehead than him, really, can you? I mean,
No, but he essentially reintroduced the flipping monarchy by nothing.
Yeah. Well, indeed, but then you know, you call it monarchy, call it dictator. I mean, this is the thing. I think Russia has no history of democracy. Its neighbours in the 1920s had no history of democracy. Austria-Hungary, Portugal. What I'm
But there was I'm just trying to say that there was a lot of there were countries that they looked at, and the UK was one of them. You know, in the way that it had a constitutional monarchy and the way that the democracy was set up.
Didn't know if that's how we're mirroring. Even Britain didn't have full suffrage in 1920, but
no.
Universal suffrage.
Well, what I'm saying is there are a lot of people who were looking at Europe and thinking, well, this is the way. We want to have some level of modernisation because we're all rural yokels, and we want.
But you know how it works, don't you? And
if you take out the Bolsheviks, you'd have to say, okay, well, who else is there? Well, all of the other factions.
There doesn't have to be anybody else. The people in charge just need to convince themselves they want to be in charge all the time.
Yeah, but they didn't do that before. Well, they
didn't have enough time.
Oh,
well, okay. So
let's carry on where you.
What I was going to say, John, is you give me the alternative to a strong man taking over.
I'm not saying that there wouldn't be somebody who was corrupt trying to stay in power.
Not necessarily corrupt. I mean, it depends what you mean by that.
Corrupt. Well, because
corrupt implies giving out
the availability
of
a democratic election was something that they'd won in the 1905 revolution. Right, so I don't think they're going to give that up. That wasn't something that they wanted to give up.
But give what up?
The fact that they could have a parliament.
Well, they might give it up if they realise they're going to lose and never have an election ever again if the Bolsheviks win. But they didn't know that.
They didn't know that at the time, but
it wouldn't have. You know, this is the thing.
Also, you've got one party which clearly states they're going to take over and there'll be no more elections. They're going to be in charge, and there isn't another party that is like that. So if you control that one party, who else?
Yeah. What happens when the price of bread? What's that nonsense in America? The price of carrots or something or milk went through the roof. So you vote for a dictator. So what happens if they can't control the economy? It's not all great. Somebody invades them, and then the alternative is because they're all happy.
Oh, so we just have to make the assumption that although they might force their way into government, they can't force their way out of a democracy where there's some sort of whoever these strongmen are.
The strongmen are the people who are there already. I'm not saying these are external people. I'm saying that Kerensky would have become a dictator.
Well, he wasn't seen. He wasn't seen as a dictator.
Well, they never are. They never. Putin wasn't seen as a dictator when he started off. They never are. Hitler wasn't seen as a dictator when he started off. They never are, unless there's a coup d'état. Nines was.
Look, I'm happy to go down the top. Because I don't know. I mean,
what I want you to do, what I'd like you to do is explain how that doesn't happen.
How what doesn't happen? That they end up.
Russia transforms itself into a happy.
I didn't say happy. I just said that they would have a democratic approach to elections, so that they would vote for their parliament.
Yeah. Okay.
And within that, at the time, but they all were different.
Right, but no governing party wins. No governing party wins every election. Who wins when they eventually lose? And let's say it's 10 years' time. Who do they lose to?
Well, does it matter in terms of the counterfactual? We're talking about Russia in the 20s, which isn't communist. What happens?
Well, that's the rest of the. I can remember my point. It isn't communist, but what is it? So it's democratic. Okay, look at the Russian nature doesn't support that. It just doesn't.
Well, you say Russian nature, but I don't think that I don't know what Russia was like in the 19th century.
It's a country in the
20th century.
It's a country in the 21st century. You can lose 750,000 dead soldiers in 4 years, not give a toss. So what on earth was it like in 1920?
But don't forget, they'd only just got rid of serfdom and all this type of stuff. So there was a lot of people who were enjoying their freedom, and they still wanted it. Would they have? They wouldn't happily have just gone, all right, I'll just put the surf coat back on.
Well, they did in the original timeline, so why wouldn't they in the
No, they did in the. They didn't put us. They didn't make them serfs again.
Well, they did. The people were had their farms taken away from them and told to work in collective farms. You know,
That was a Bolshevik thing.
correct.
Yeah,
So-
well, there wouldn't have been a Bolshevik thing.
Yeah, but the point being is that it happened, and nobody stopped it. So, now, explain to me how Russia becomes a happy clappy democracy.
I've never said it's a happy clappy democracy. I just said it has a democracy. That's all. That's it. There's other countries that have democracies and they're not happy clappy.
Yeah, they're happier than bloody Russia in the 1930s. If you're starving to death in Ukraine. My point being is I struggle to mentally form a picture of how, because a democracy means that you happily give up power when you're defeated in an election. Somebody should learn that lesson and do something about it. But so so you respect elections. Biden is respected in an election. His predecessor didn't. So how do we think that's understood in this 1920s alternative Russia that you lose an election, that's fine?
Well, I'm happy to go either way. So, which way do you want it to go? Because I don't know. I mean, you're asking me some really detailed stuff which we never get into normally.
Well, no, I did say that because I think the thing about Russia is that the Russian Revolution is probably it is the most pivotal point of the entire the entire 20th century. Everything that follows, but mostly, it didn't cause the Second World War, but had a massive impact. State of the Blend of the Office, Cold War, the state of the.
Well, say that there was still some dictator in Russia, but they weren't communist. What would that have done to Hitler then? So would he have still hated the communists? I don't know. There's on to you then. So Russia? So
It could have always one. But if he was a nationalist, he would be. If he was a Russian nationalist, he would be similar to Hungary, Romania, etc. Now, whether that would have stopped him invading, it would have been possibly would have invaded.
So let's move that forward to.
Yeah, but you're jumping to my timeline. You haven't really explained what your democratic timeline looks like.
Well, we've moved on from it being a democracy because I don't have the answer. It's pointless me trying to come up with something that will keep you happy when I don't.
No, actually, it's not about me being happy or not. It's for our listeners to be thought.
No, but I don't have the details about say. Well, I think this would have happened and that would have happened.
Well,
it's just coming up from.
I'm just looking at what I mean. I think there's always parallels. If you look at what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a brief flirting with democracy for about 7 or 8 years, and then they fell into dictatorship, or fell into dictatorship. And I think that's a direct, it's the same people when all said and done. They were quite happy with that, as long as they were getting paid and all the rest of it, and had, bread on the table and stuff. They seemed happy with that. So I think that's a reasonable, and they were fueled by nationalism and tricks and various ruses to believe that there was external threats and internal threats, all that sort of typical sort of stuff. It's hard to imagine that in 1920 or 1924, somebody in Russia would happily say, right, I've lost the election, I'll just give it up to this bloke.
All right, well, so they did. It's.
But to avoid, but the alternative of that is to become a national. You have a nationalist, not Nazi, but you have a nationalist government. Well, to be fair, most governments in the 1920s were nationalist. With a couple of exceptions. They were inward looking. And trying to persuade each other that they were better than everybody else and all that sort of stuff to various degrees. And I think it's hard to imagine Russia, which is doing that as we speak, wouldn't do that in 1920, even though they might call themselves. I mean, they still have elections in Russia today, but
no, I know, but there's only one person on the ballot, isn't there?
Well, there's usually somebody else, but he's the person who hasn't been chucked out of a window and is happy. Is obviously a crony. Yeah.
So either we accept that that's just a repeat of what would have happened, or you accept that there's going to be more than one nationalist on the ballot. And
that's an interesting thought, isn't it? You're right, and they could. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't have to be. But the question is do the Bolsheviks transform themselves into just nationalists? And I keep saying nationalists. I do not mean Nazi. I mean nationalist. Just
yeah, I know.
I'm better.
I know what you mean.
MAGA, if you want a better expression, I'm better than you because I happen to be born somewhere. Not had any decision in it. But so that's distinctly possible that they could have transformed themselves in that, or they could have been purged. They could have been Stalin was a nationalist, ironically, even though he was a Georgian. He was a Soviet nationalist, for want of a better expression. I mean, Yeah, so it's possible they could have transformed. But then the temptation of nationalists, as we've seen with Putin, is that the elections become a bit boring. I was spotting his elections. That Putin's killed his opponents.
Yeah, let's try and avoid talking about the modern day. We are trying to talk about the 20s and even forward into the 30s.
Yeah.
In terms of some form of industrialized Russian nationalist country.
Yeah, so the one thing that they wouldn't have done, hopefully, because they wouldn't have had Stalin, is they wouldn't have had all these purges. They wouldn't have had people who have good ideas being sent off to camps and starved to death. He wouldn't have got rid of all his best generals because they disagreed with them.
So the potential for Russia would be quite a strong industrial. It has the potential to be a strong industrial nation. Doesn't mean to say that they wouldn't suddenly start sweeping across the land invading Germany. So that could certainly have happened. That they could have ended up with a leader saying, "Well, we're going to take over Japan and we're going to take over."
I think the scenario would have been, they've always had eyes on, they did it anyway, but they've always had eyes on Scandinavian countries. They had eyes on Poland. They
wanted Turkey because they wanted Istanbul. That was one of the deals for.
Always wanted a warm support for their navy. Yeah, so there's definitely, and the nationalists would concoct any reason. Poland's the obvious one because that this really part of Greater Russia, Lithuania, Turkey's an out and out wars. There's very little justification other than raw.
Oh, but I mean it's access to the sea, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But you can't pretend that there's any Russian history in Turkey. Yeah, so I think a nationalist government in Russia would do that because we've seen it doing it throughout the decades.
So we could have ended up with two Nazis and nationalist Russians because at that time, let's face it, that's a different time. That was a different time. Warfare was different. People might have been, I know that they will invade other countries, but they might have felt a lot easier invading other countries.
I don't think they have much trouble invading countries at any point, to be honest, in terms of in terms of the impact back home, for want of a better expression.
Yeah.
So the question is again though, if as you pointed out, if Hitler didn't have the threat of communism anymore, would he have invaded the Soviet Union or what is now Russia? Obviously, I suspect he might not have done. Because he didn't see it.
They would have been more. Yeah, they would have been more powerful for a start.
And it would have been an existential threat. He always, ultimately Hitler always did what he said he was going to do, and he was always intending to invade the Soviet Union because he saw it as a threat to Germany. Now it would have been a different type of threat, but I don't think Russia would ever really.
Well, if you could say, that. So if Hitler didn't invade Russia, what would the outcome of the Second World War have been?
Well, there wouldn't have been a second war, would there? Not.
Well, I mean, Hitler might still have invaded Poland. But...
Well, but then I think Russia would have. I mean, Russia did invade Poland, obviously, but Russia might have invaded Poland before, in the mid 1930s, long before Germany was.
I mean, I think they would have been competitors. But they would have they wouldn't necessarily have been friendly. But
no, they would be
friendly or pretend to be friendly in the first place. They'd have always been antagonistic to each other,
like Russia and Russia and China today. I mean, just wary of each other.
Yeah, which would prevent them from one attacking the other because they know that it's going to cause. There's no easy solution. Whereas I think at the time Russia looked like an easy target. If it's not an easy target, Hitler probably wouldn't have attacked.
Yeah, that's an whole other conversation. How on earth they ever thought they could defeat them?
Well, yeah,
but
the issue that I'm trying to get to is that if the German army that was fighting the Russians didn't fight the Russians and they were actually in the western part of Europe, that would have had quite a significant impact. And of course, 3/4 of the German army fighting the Russians.
Yeah, but we've had this conversation before. You don't have to kill.
I'd say there'd be a nuclear bomb over Berlin. First.
You don't need to kill. You don't need to kill soldiers to win a war. Modern armies do not just go around killing people.
But D-Day would have been a lot harder if there had been twice as many Germans.
Yeah, but you can't get twice as many Germans onto a battlefield. This is the point. There's only so many people. There's only so many tanks, and the more tanks you have, the more targets there are for your strategic.
I know, but yeah, they would have had more tanks than they had, and which
means they'd have lost more. This is the reason that they lost so many soldiers in the Eastern Front is because they had so many soldiers in the Eastern Front in the first place. It's a bit, it's not as straightforward as that, but there's a definite element. The more targets you have, the more they get attacked.
I know, but you can't say there wouldn't be an impact if
there would have been absolutely, but you couldn't physically get twice as many soldiers.
I know, but still would have been a lot more soldiers than
potentially.
It would have had an impact. I can't see how it couldn't have.
It wouldn't have influenced.
Well, we need a real military person.
It wouldn't have influenced their end result. They would just have been harder.
Yeah. If we've had people who listen to this who are military historians.
Yeah. I mean, you've only got to look at, again, they're attacking Ukraine. You can chuck as many soldiers into a battle you like. All that results is in getting killed. Doesn't achieve anything. But the going back to our timeline, I think that, to try and summarize, the timeline, I think, without a Bolshevik revolution is a flirting with democracy, full democracy. People getting a bit scared about the capitalism, and the impact it has to people. People lose their jobs, industries go bust, other industries replace them, but that sort of transition. The ruling party being a bit scared by that, thinking, oh God, it's not good, is it? Potentially an alternative coming up who is similar to them, but then them sort of saying, well, we need to be popular, we need to be Russian, and that develops into a pseudo-democracy. Whether they still have fake elections, who knows? But then Russia becomes stronger because it's got resources. It isn't purging people. It isn't cracking down.
Well, it's not inefficient in the way.
Exactly, it's not cracking on capitalism. So it's letting farmers farm. There's no famines. It's letting people in its army espouse alternative views of looking at things, because that's how you develop new ways of doing things. You aren't going to kill all your generals. So it becomes a reasonably secure semi-democracy, inverted commas. But, you can say what you like, but you can't necessarily vote for who you like. So, and it's a successful country now, because it's nationalist. I think it has to be. It's as you say, it's looking around it. It's looking at Poland. It's looking at Turkey, thinking, yeah, we've got a capability. Why don't we just go and do it? And in the 1930s, nobody could really stop them if they were well, certainly Turkey couldn't, if they were well organised. So there's potential flashpoints there. Whether those flashpoints were turned into a Second World War, I don't know. It's quite a big question.
Well, probably, yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's actually more in this one that we could maybe we'll come back.
Well, there is, because I think that I think the big question is what his relationship would be with Nazi Germany. So what would a nationalist, and I don't mean Nazi because I don't think they're particularly racist in the same way that Nazis are. There's no racism as such, because there's an awful lot of different types of people in Russia. And I think
that's true.
Don't just even in Russia, there's an awful lot of different types of people. So they're not particularly racist, and they weren't particularly anti-Semitic in the 20th century. Obviously, they were in the late 19th century, pogroms and such. But that was mostly desire, to be honest. But turned a blind eye. So they're not Nazis, they're not racists, but they are nationalists. What's their relationship with Nazi Germany? And there's the Second World War. And does American Britain and France just sit and watch them as they get on with it?
Well, on that bombshell, then,
not the bombshell over Berlin.
No, not the one over Berlin.
No.
I think we'll have to call it a day.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll come back to this one and pick it up from there. But any questions from anybody, any feedback? Always love to hear it. We get swamped with the amount of feedback that we get, and so we'd love to hear more. And obviously hopefully we've got people thinking, got an opinion you want to say.
Yeah, and let us know what
we're foul or whatever.
Let me know, I suppose, as to what the path of true democracy is for Russia.
Right, yeah. So Conversations in Time on X, Twitter, and Blue Sky. And no, it's not. It's ORC_time on X, Twitter, and Blue Sky, and Conversations in Time on Facebook. That's right, isn't it? Yeah,
Facebook. Yeah. It seems wrong when you said it, but no, that's exactly what.
No, that's right. It's because of the Christmas holiday, the Christmas break.
I thought you were going to say FaceTime, and that's something completely different. Yeah.
Well, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Look out for our next one, which should be slightly different. So hopefully you'll enjoy that one as much as you enjoy this. Thanks a lot for listening. We'll be back again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.